All right, let's get started. So first thing on the agenda is regarding if we should add master nodes to the cloud LBs. So there was a discussion with Clayton, Justin, and Tim on one of the issues. Oh, and I think also Jordan. Anyway, oh no, sorry, Josh. So anyways, yeah, we're talking about whether we want to add the master kubelets as under like backends for the LB. So right now we look for a specific label on a node to determine if it's a master, and the label was created from kubeatom, I think. And if we see that label, we essentially like don't add the node to the LB pool. Personally, I think that we should start adding nodes to the LB pool because we already have a label to like specifically exclude nodes. And we also have the local external traffic policy for us to not send traffic to a master node if it doesn't run a pod for that service. If there's any, like, does anyone have thoughts on that? I know, Justin, you had some opinions on that issue.
I can certainly give a little bit of background. I mean, I think what originally happened was from the early days, the master did not receive traffic. GKE obviously doesn't expose the masters, so there's no, like, it doesn't sort of arise on GKE. And I think there were some bugs in around 1.4-ish or something, where we started exposing the master, and I think we changed. Oh, it was we didn't expose unschedulable nodes, and originally the master in kubeup would appear as unschedulable. And when we changed that to a taint intoleration, so that was in 1.6, traffic did start going to the master, and people were like, "Why are you sending traffic to my master? Like, you're going to DOS my master. My master's undersized, and I don't want, like, you know, massive network traffic going through my master," which seems fair. And so that's when we cleaned it up, or I cleaned it up and added the label selection logic. So there is a camp that believes that it is a bug to send it through the master. And then I think some people added some labels that will, I can't remember which way around it is, but I'm worried it might be the wrong way around, where you can effectively like override that and either force a node to opt in or out of load balancer selection. And I think though that is feature flagged currently. So I'm unclear. Like, obviously if we sufficiently communicate it, we can make the change in COPS and kubeup and like the other majors. I think the biggest risk is that we risk breaking or changing the behavior on third parties that are rolling their own installations.
Yeah, so I think the biggest argument for adding masters is because of that feature you're talking about, where if we give users the option to exclude a specific node, then they can manually add that exclusion themselves, instead of us like relying on some hard-coded label for master. I do see your point though of how do we transition people onto that model, especially like third-party distributions for Kubernetes.
That's why I wanted, like, I can't remember which way around the label was, but I was imagining that we would have a label which was yes. Well, the obvious one is just don't label your node as a master if you don't want it to be treated as a master, right? But currently master has a whole bunch of behaviors, although this is actually one of the main ones. And it would be great to disaggregate that behavior, but to have another label which says, although I want to label you a master, do send traffic to it. That to me seems like a clear opt-in with an easy transition, but I think we did it the other way around, which has a harder transition story.
Yeah.
So I mean, let me throw in my opinion, which is that we have a nasty tendency in our community to allow the customer to shoot themselves in the foot if they're not deeply knowledgeable about the system. And the idea of I can throw traffic at the control plane, which will then cause my system to stop behaving correctly, seems like another example of letting the customer shoot themselves in the foot. I'm not against allowing you to send traffic, but I think it should clearly not be the default behavior.
So I think both for maintaining the current behavior and not switching it, no matter how much we message it, it doesn't seem to ever get through to everyone when we change the behavior.
Yeah.
So I think for both maintaining the current behavior and to require an explicit opt-in to traffic going to the master, it sounds like both of those are arguments for maybe adding the ability, but making it explicit send traffic. Does that make sense to others? And did I capture that right?
Yeah, I think so. I think, yeah, it's not ideal. I think because obviously we want to get to a point where like because we already have a feature for excluding, so it seems odd that we are adding another feature to include masters only.
But I think Walter's point is that it may be dangerous to include, and so requiring exclusion is different than allowing inclusion explicitly.
I mean, if we said something where we said you have to go in and unexclude the master, but I think we at minimum we should find a way to have it excluded by default. If you want to go with an exclusion model, I mean, inclusion's a little easier because then you have to turn off the inclusion or turn on the inclusion rather than turning off the exclusion. But I do think it needs to be the default behavior that we don't have the master as schedulable.
Yeah, my point is that the exclusion model was already added. And it's already like an alpha feature for, I don't know, like 3 releases or something.
Yeah.
And so like, do we want to go with the exclusion model, but have an exception for masters, or do we want to just kind of like roll things back or like, so I'm curious for VMware and I don't know if anyone from AWS is here, but like, is this a common problem with those providers?
Well, not really for us because we don't really support right now load balancers and because we don't have it in a platform, but we're actually working on that because we have a vSphere on AWS service, which is actually using ELB as load balancer. We're actually working on implementing that part in the cloud provider because vSphere is still vSphere, but it also has access to ELB. And from my perspective, I think the ideal way forward would be to have an inclusion model because right now, it makes more sense to have that explicitly including masters, given that most of the use case, most of the end user should really not use traffic on master unless like it's something very specific use case for it, because it was pointed out that it might become problematic if people would just allow that by default. Definitely not the default thing to do. And same will be, if you ask me, if I were to implement that, I will just have it, explicitly included in the traffic instead of having, working in an exclusion model works. It's just, kind of backward when you think about it. Like you have it excluded by default, so you have to unexclude it, which is backward. But it's, I guess my understanding is the current the current status quo is that, and we might want to implement that. It's more straightforward implementing it. But again, I think it has to be communicated. Either way, it has to be communicated effectively to whoever is using it.
I think also the way this came up was that someone was doing a single node installation, and I think there is an alternative apparently, which is just not to label a single node as the master, because it is, although it is a master, it is also a node, which is something we don't currently have as a concept, that a node can be in multiple roles. It feels like the bundling, the very notion of node roles and the bundling of these things is certainly convenient, but is also problematic for people that want to like break the roles a little bit.
Yeah, I think also for OpenShift, they do like multi-master, like API server aggregation or something like that. And then they put those behind LBs. And so if you have an LB for the control plane, then they want to be able to like have kind of a self-hosted LB that can send traffic to the masters, which currently is not possible. Okay, so yeah, I think, okay, so it seems like step forward might be to consider an inclusion model or some sort of mix. I can talk to whoever led the feature for being able to exclude nodes and then go from there. I don't think we need to talk about this anymore though.
Just one last, there was an external traffic policy local. There was possibly another workaround, which is like if you say external traffic policy local and you explicitly schedule workloads to tolerate your master, which is presumably tainted if you're sort of following the local model, maybe that is a sufficient opt-in. Like that is a very clear, like I think I know what I'm doing and I want you to do that. So it might be that we already have it if you're using external traffic policy local. That might also be sufficient.
Okay, yeah. Let me just write that down. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll dig into that. So next, Tim Hawkin wanted us to just kind of announce that we have SETP support in LBs in 112, I think. So if your provider supports it, then just FYI. And then,
do you want to give us a Cliff's notes on what SETP is?
That's as far as I know. So I'm just kind of
okay.
Do you want to give?
No, I was Googling it to like find out. I don't know if anyone else knows, or if AWS supports it or GCE supports it. Does anyone support it?
I'm skimming through the PR and it looks like a GCP load balancer support SCTP, which I don't know what that is, but that's what Tim Hawkins says in the comments. So
it's an alternative to TCP or UDP.
Yeah. Is it? Okay.
I think
the side of this project, right?
It's like TCP for what I've read, I confess, but with multiple streams. So
multiplex TCP.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
Yeah, I think the original was for like on-premise purposes, but they kind of just ported it over for LBs in case they supported it. I don't know. But yeah, in the future, if your provider supports it, then look at that PR. So next one is on Slack. Last week, we talked a little bit about setting concrete deadlines for removing the provider code in Kubernetes/Kubernetes. And I think in that discussion, we kind of floated 113 as a potential deadline. So yeah, I don't know. I want to spend some time to talk about like if we think 113 is realistic. I don't think it is, only because I think 113 is realistic if we're moving from like package cloud provider / providers to like a staging directory in Kubernetes / Kubernetes, but to actually like get it out of Kubernetes in 113 is pretty aggressive, because that means that you have to build your binaries out of tree. And I'm sure that's a big challenge for a lot of providers.
So I would actually like to strengthen both of those statements. I think that getting the staging, all cloud providers into staging is a really good goal, but I even think that's probably slightly aggressive. I don't know, I tried to share the doc, I don't know if anyone looked at it, but it showed a lot of the dependencies that have to be dealt with, including things like the Kubernetes package runtime for doing things like checking cloud provider types. In addition, there's certain work that we had asked for other SIGs to do, such as we'd asked SIG node to move their cloud provider calls out of node lifecycle controller, which, as far as I know, they at least a quarter or two behind on getting done. So I think even just getting it into staging is something that we're going to find slightly challenging.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I feel like we just need to start doing the work, because I'm sure even with all the things we listed, there's probably more blockers that we just don't see.
Oh, I mean, I don't know if you saw my list, but I think I found 20 downstream or upstream dependencies that need to be dealt with from within the Kubernetes code base. So, I mean, there is a sizable chunk of work that needs to be done to get that extraction to happen. So yeah, but at the same time, it's not going to happen unless we start doing it. And in fact, my first couple of PRs will start rolling out this week, but that, you know, when we're looking at 20 dependencies at least and 7 cloud providers, that's quite a lot of work. And not all the dependencies do we know how to deal with yet.
So can we maybe start with a target roadmap of what happens, like in what order, and you know, a commitment for the next quarter or two from the folks who are participating in this group, and then update that at the end of each quarter and see if we're making progress or what we need to do to get back on track.
Yeah, so I've updated Walter's KEP to include 3 steps in moving the provider code. So the controller code, the cloud-specific controller code, I'm treating as kind of a separate problem because it ties directly into other entry things that we haven't thought about. But specifically provider code, which is under package cloud provider providers, I think we can kind of do those in 3 steps, which is to move it to staging and then move it out, but still build, but like vendor it from an external repo and then remove the entry code. So I think those can be all done in 113, 114, and 115.
So moving it out, I will warn you, is going to be a little interesting unless we have a special repo just for the interface. So cloud.go is just the definition of the interface. And I think the cloud providers themselves have to compile against that.
Yeah,
so that's entry. Well, as long as we're in tree, we're fine. But when we want to break out of tree, that I think has to be the first thing we break. We got to break that into its own vendor or non-vendor repo.
Yeah. So what I'm assuming is that there's a transitional period where, like, the provider code may be like just in the repository, but we may still vendor like cloud.go and all of the kind of the main interfaces. And if we do that, then it seems more doable to do in like the next release or 2. It's not pretty to have like the cloud code vendored like that, but it seems like the out-of-tree providers do that today and it works. And it seems like a reasonable kind of incremental step.
In the meantime, is there some additional effort we should be putting into the EDE test to test especially the upgrade downgrade across some of those boundaries that is generic enough to work across cloud providers and have that be part of the criteria?
Yes.
That would be an interesting effort to sketch out.
Jacob, do you mean upgrade, downgrade, as in adopting CCM from KCM, or?
I mean, for an existing cluster of that is depending on in-tree cloud provider and upgrading it to use the external cloud provider, testing that X, Y, and Z are true and working, and then the whole upgrade didn't work, downgrade back and test that it's still functional. I think that this is where the tricky bits always rise up. It's not.
I think we should I definitely think that's important, but it can be done in parallel because once we move like things to staging, I think we're gonna give a higher sense of like urgency to the effort, and that may kind of give us more reason to actually add those end-to-end tests before we kind of pull the trigger on removing the code. So what I would like to do is once the 112 code freeze is done, or once 112 is out, or when master is open again, I'd like to just move it all to staging and then start talking about like what those migration paths look like and whatnot. I just feel like we've been talking about moving things to staging for a while, and I just want to like do it and then worry about like things that may break, like fix it in the PR or fix it afterwards or something. And I want to do it like in the beginning of a release cycle so that we have plenty of time to figure things out as we go.
I like that approach.
I know that there was a feature branch that was used for apply, or is being used for apply v2. So we could try to do this in a feature branch, I think even outside of the release schedule, and start EDE testing it maybe. I don't know if we have any EDE tests right now that use CCM, question mark.
Yeah, I don't think there's any EDE tests for CCM.
So I mean, that is something we could do, I think, without even waiting for the freeze to lift, right? If we had a feature branch. And I think we should also talk to SIG testing or test infra, because I know that complicated tests like upgrade tests have been challenging in the past, and I think we probably likely would like a better or a different strategy for those going forwards.
Well, and I think there are some unique challenges that we're going to face when we do the upgrade from a KCM only to a KCM CCM model. So we know, for instance, I mean, and for people who are already running CCM, this is fine. But anyone who's doing that transition, we've got to worry about things like the service controller and the route controller, which are going to be running in one process before the upgrade, in a different process after the upgrade. And if you look at what happens in the HA model, you actually end up where, if you do the naive thing, you get a guaranteed where the same controller is running in two different processes. So we're going to have some interesting problems there.
Yeah, bringing this up scares me a bit, because at least for the vSphere cloud provider, and I suspect others, we're anticipating a move to CSI storage that would correlate with the cloud provider itself. And that has some interesting upgrade, downgrade possibilities as well.
So the good news there, and I definitely recommend talking to SIG Storage, but while you're dealing with the CSI model, all the existing storage mechanisms should just get CSI swapped as the implementation while the interface stays the same. So in theory, that one should be fairly seamless. Obviously, we should have tests for that.
Hey, Walter, for the service route controller problem you're talking about,
yeah,
would it be overkill to have like endpoint leader election per controller there, so that if you happen to spin it up in CCM and KCM, it can kind of figure out which one to run?
I've bounced that idea around. I think it's worth discussing. There's some weird things that happen with the leader elect, though. So one of the assumptions the leader election makes is that it's running across multiple controllers. So if it loses the election, if you're a leader and you lose your lease, you kill the process you're running in. And so there's some weird oddities that can happen if you're holding multiple leases, because that can cause sort of cascading lease failures and some other weird conditions to happen.
Yeah, what I meant was that the KCM and CCM would share the same lease.
No. Well, so we can't have them share the same lease because they're different processes, and that would exclude you having both a KCM leader and a CCM leader. What you could do is say that rather than having one global lease they share, you could say, I have a service lease and I have a route lease and I have a KCM lease and I have a CCM lease. But I think that takes some thinking, because it's not really how the lease system was designed to be used.
Okay.
Okay, so for the purposes of this discussion, the complexity is secondary, and the when can we do these things is the primary part of this conversation. So sounds like Andrew is eager to submit a PR that is a forcing function to fix some stuff quick. In principle, I'm happy with that, but I think Walter and from the vSphere side, sorry, I forget who is talking.
Fabio.
Stephen. And Fabio, if you guys can do some legwork before this group meets again in 2 weeks, and confirm that there are no obvious that can't work because bullet points, that would be super helpful.
Sure thing.
And barring those objections, then it sounds like we're aligned. Yes?
Yep.
Yeah, and to make my intentions from earlier clear, so what I want is to rush the move to staging, and then once we're in staging, then start talking about like put more effort into migration strategy, build pipelines, and then all those other things that we want to worry about. And then once we have those kind of figured out, then we can go on to the next phase, which is to kind of like start talking about actually removing the code and then whatnot.
Okay, so rush and then be careful.
Yeah.
Instead of
because you can still build everything the way it is with the provider code and staging. That should technically not break anything, technically.
What could possibly go wrong?
Yeah. But yeah, I guess we'll talk about it again next meeting because I don't think 1.12 will be out by then. And then once 1.12 is out, we can start pushing some code out.
Okay. The lack of EDE tests makes me uncomfortable because I feel like we don't even have a baseline to know if we broke something. So,
well, and I would actually like to emphasize on that one. As part of SIG API machinery, we were looking into some problems in the versioned cache queries. And we found that there are quite a few bugs that have been fixed in the KCM that have not, that were evidently still in the CCM by code inspection. And so I think 2 points there. One is, I think to Jago's point, we need some E to E tests to make sure that the CCM is really as healthy as we want it to be. And the other is that we maybe want to see if we can start sharing a bit more code between the KCM and the CCM so that we don't keep losing out on these fixes that go into the KCM because it's better tested.
Yeah, I agree. That'd be nice.
sounds good.
I can certainly work on getting like the COPS configuration to get a CCM build working on or being into ETE tests. I won't say working for like GCE and AWS if we have them, and that should just work. And QBAP is the one that's in a weird spot, right?
So Justin, come bug me because it may not be quite as easy as you think. And I know I've gotten it to work on GCE, so I may be able to help bootstrap that.
Awesome, thank you.
Cool.
Okay. That's the end of our agenda.
Yeah, I think that's it. Unless anyone else wanted to bring up anything.
No, these meetings get no less interesting week to week, though. I will say that.
Yeah. Cool. Nothing?
All right. Thanks, everybody.
See you.
Have a great day.
Bye, folks.
Thanks, everyone.